Her name was whispered through the cracked walls of shattered cities, carved into the silence of war-torn nights, and then, just like smoke slipping through fingers, she vanished. In the blood-soaked year of 1944, one of the Third Reich's most hunted enemies disappeared without a goodbye, a witness, or a body. They called her the Night Widow, a phantom with steel in her veins and vengeance behind her eyes. For 50 years, her story was buried beneath ruins and rumors, dismissed by history, swallowed by fear. But when a rusted lockbox surfaced in a crumbling farmhouse in the forests of Alsace, letters sealed in wax and spine-chilling photographs told a story too vivid to deny. The truth they uncovered rewrote everything about the war, about her fate, and about how far a woman would go when her country, her family, and her soul had been stripped away. She was born Élise Marchand, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a violinist, in the sleepy village of WW2’s. Before the war, she was poems and paintbrushes, laughter skipping over cobblestone, a girl whose eyes shimmered with the curiosity of someone still learning how to dream. Her hands, trained to dance over piano keys, would one day hold a dagger with poise and precision. But it was in 1939, when steel wings darkened the sky and the roar of tanks reached her valley, that her innocence caved in under the weight of smoke and screams. The Gestapo came for her father first, accusing him of printing radical literature. They broke his fingers in front of her. Her mother vanished 2 days later, dragged into a truck that trailed cigarette smoke and silence. That night, Élise buried the family violin in the garden, the soft soil marking the grave of the world she once knew. From that moment on, she became someone else, a ghost in training. Paris was burning, not with fire but with secrets and shadows. In the winter of 1941, Élise re-emerged under a new name, forged papers, and a frostbitten resolve. As Claire Moreau, she vanished into the black veins of the French resistance, slipping between identities like silk through clenched fists. Her portraits changed, languages shifted, and accents melted into whatever air surrounded her. She was courier, saboteur, assassin. A woman who carried cyanide pills in her sleeve and coded maps laced into her hair. The Gestapo never saw her face twice. Allied commanders spoke of a ghostly operative, flawless in execution, impossible to trace. They said she sabotaged a Nazi munitions train with a single flare, luring it over a bridge rigged with charges, watching from the trees as iron screamed into the ravine below. But beneath every mission's success lay something colder, quieter, an ache. She never spoke aloud. Not for vengeance, not anymore. This was something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. In March of 1942, she entered the tunnels beneath Lyon with a satchel of explosives and a code phrase scorched into memory. The catacombs were a place where light went to die, where the breath of the city above was swallowed whole by stone and shadow. By day, these paths served as forgotten arteries for the black market. By night, they became stages for sabotage. A German supply depot funneled ammunition directly through one of these tunnels, guarded by men bored into complacency until Élise arrived. She didn't come with an army. She came alone, a whisper in the dark, dressed as a cleaning maid with ink on her gloves and sulfur beneath her nails. What followed was silent, surgical bloodlessness, the kind of violence that leaves no echoes. But when the explosion came, it roared like a resurrected god. 60 tons of ammunition shattered in a blink, leveling part of the old city and echoing well beyond the hills of Burgundy. The Germans called it der rote Riss, the red slit, for the jagged scar it carved into their network. But Élise left no name. Only a monarch butterfly drawn in chalk on a cellar wall, wings cracked in perfect halves. The monarch butterfly became her signature, a delicate symbol streaked onto chaos like a defiant whisper. Its meaning? No one knew. Some thought it a warning, others a lament. To Élise, it was memory of her mother's perfume, of freedom once held and lost, but symbols could not protect her from the weight of what came next. The red slit was a triumph, but it also stirred the hornet's nest. The Gestapo launched Operation Falkenjag Falcon Hunt, aimed specifically at flushing out Allied operatives like her, and they were close. Too close. Her safe houses began turning cold. Contacts vanished. One by one, her fellow fighters were hung in town squares, their eyes left open as warnings. Élise knew the clock was running out. Lyon could no longer hold her secrets. She left in darkness, moving east toward the Vosges Mountains, guided by an old comrade who swore he had found a way across enemy lines into Switzerland. But before they made it, gunfire split the trees at dusk like a scream through a prayer. When dawn burned away the fog, only one set of prints remained in the snow, and the world never saw her again. For decades, her name was reduced to rumor, her legacy filtered through the mouths of dying men and faded ink in forbidden journals. Survivors spoke of her in contradictions: monster and martyr, assassin and angel. Official records listed her as missing in action. The French government never acknowledged her true identity, and the Allies quietly erased her from communiques. But time does not forget the weight of silence. In 1994, a cold autumn rain fell across the village of Thann when a farmhouse was unearthed during a controlled demolition. Beneath rotting beams and collapsed brick, they found a lockbox sealed with wax and bound by a leather strap scorched at the edges. Inside, it lay items that did not belong to just any fugitive: a blood-stained glove, a cyanide capsule, a delicate silver pendant carved with a butterfly wings, fractured but unmistakable. There were letters, too, written in code but laced with fragments of truth that bled between the lines, and amid them, a final note unsigned, but ending with 6 words that sent chills down the spines of every investigator: "Tell them I was never lost." Within days, historians, intelligence officers, and private truth-seekers descended upon Thann like moths to a long-extinguished flame. The note sparked a fevered hunt stretching from Parisian archives to CIA declassified vaults, each page peeled back revealing threads too intricate to be coincidence. One letter pointed to a photograph archived in a London war museum, a blurred figure, standing defiantly beside a downed German aircraft, her face turned just enough to match the cheekbone scar whispered of in resistance records. Another document, buried in a former Nazi officer's journal, detailed a prisoner detonating a convoy from the inside outside Zurich in late 1944. They'd marked her dead, but no body was ever recovered. With each revelation, a shape began to emerge, not a ghost, but a woman carved by grief and sharpened in fire. A woman who had not vanished, but who had chosen disappearance over martyrdom. Somewhere, amid the ruins of history's silence, Élise Marchand had survived. But survival has its own grave cost. As investigators followed the faint trail of cryptic documents and blurred photographs, a pattern began to emerge, one that traced Elise's final days not to Switzerland, but deep into the Black Forest, near a remote monastery that had once served as a field hospital, then a Waffen SS outpost. There, in the archives of the Abbey of St. Blasius, dusty and untouched since 1945, they found a logbook penned in Latin and German. Hidden between prayer records and requisition slips was a single entry, dated December 3, 1944. A woman arrived bleeding, carried by a deserter. French tongue, refuses to pray. Drew a butterfly in the frost. Beneath that, a final note. Vanished before dawn. No footprints in snow, only silence. It was as if nature itself conspired to hide her. And yet, across 70 years of doubt and misdirection, that simple image, a butterfly fading into ice, endured. The world had lost her once. But history, relentless and unsleeping, had finally begun to find her. The trail led next to one man, a former OSS operative turned reclusive professor, now in his 90s and blind in both eyes, living in self-imposed silence in a nursing home in Vermont. His name had surfaced in connection with clandestine resistance activities, but he had always refused to speak of the war. Until, presented with the butterfly pendant unearthed from the Thann farmhouse, his trembling fingers recoiled in recognition. He whispered only 3 words: "She saved me." What followed was a confession no one expected. In late 1944, he had been apprehended near Zurich, suspected of aiding Allied spies. Tortured and left for dead, he was rescued by a woman with a fractured voice and the scent of lavender ash. She had no name, only a promise that no one would remember her, but someone must remember what was right. And just like that, she was gone into the mountains, her shadow etched against the snowscape like a memory refusing to melt. What he remembered most was not her face, but the way she moved, fluid, unyielding, as if walking between worlds. In his dreams, he saw her not as a warrior but as a revenant, draped in the hush of falling snow and the smoke of burning offenses. He described the pendant in painful detail, the butterfly not as an emblem of beauty but as a scar, fragile, permanent. And then, with a hoarse breath, he revealed something that hardened every heart in the room. Élise had not merely escaped to survive, she had orchestrated her own myth. A trail of false deaths, doctored leads, and carefully planted relics had been her final act of rebellion. She didn't want to be remembered as a victim or a legend. She wanted to vanish on her own terms, leaving behind only symbols for the world to question. Her legacy was not etched in monuments, but in the quiet revolution of forgotten resistance, in the endless echo of a name once whispered through ruined cities, now rising from the silence like a breath returned to the living. Then came the most unexpected fracture in the mystery, a surviving contact. A man presumed dead since the war emerged beneath the ticking hands of time. In 2003, deep within the Carpathians, a weather-beaten cabin was discovered during a logging survey. Inside, amidst decaying crates and rusted typewriters, was a ledger containing coded rendezvous instructions written in an unmistakable hand, the same loops and flourishes that matched Elise's letters found in Than. But what stunned historians was the additional signature. Lucas Ehrlich, her former handler in the Polish underground, presumed executed in 1945. Interviews later confirmed that Ehrlich had faked his own death and fled east, cradling stories too dangerous to share. And one of them bled like fire through his final journal entries. She was not merely running from death, she was blinding history. She believed truth could be weaponized, misused, corrupted. In his words, Élise hadn't vanished. She had become something else entirely, a shadow forged by necessity, a myth curated with rage, and a memory reborn only when the world was finally willing to see her as she truly was. Still, even shadows cast echoes. In 2006, beneath the marble corridors of the French National Archives, a redacted dossier, misfiled beneath agricultural records, was rediscovered by an intern cataloging documents for digitalization. Inside were photographs dated post-war, taken in Santiago, Chile, of a bookstore owner known only as Madame Claire. The photos bore a startling resemblance to Élise, older, lined by decades, but unmistakable in the set of her jaw and the absent ring finger on her left hand, a battlefield injury long attributed to the phantom known as the Night Widow. Witness accounts described a mysterious French woman fluent in German, who hinted at a past soaked in fire. She spoke little, kept no friends, but always placed a single chalk butterfly in the window during September. The revelation sent ripples through historical and intelligence communities, but by the time officials arrived in Santiago, the shop had burned to its foundations. No one knew if by accident or design. Amid the ashes, they found a single surviving object, the scorched remains of a violin string curled like a question mark, as if, even in erasure, she chose the poetry of silence as her final signature. But history is often louder than flames, and it refuses to leave its ghosts unseen. After the Santiago fire, the ashes were sifted for weeks. Among them, historians recovered partially burned pages, scraps of handwriting, ink blurred by heat but miraculously legible in parts. One note was written on the inside cover of a torn book of Rilke's poetry. "Is it not enough to burn for meaning quietly from behind the page?" That sentence alone electrified researchers. The handwriting matched earlier verified samples from Elise's early correspondences. More than that, the choice of poet revealed a through line, threading through her life between music and memory, destruction and defiance. What began as the hunt for a vanished operative had become something deeper, a meditation on the architecture of disappearance, on the sacred power of anonymity in a world addicted to visibility. The story of Élise Marchand had not been a vanishing, it had been a choice, a performance. A final furious act of authorship in a war that wanted to script her as either victim or vengeance. And perhaps it is fitting, then, that to this day, scattered in hidden corners from Alsace to Santiago, silent chalk outlines of butterflies still appear in September drawn by unknown hands, a tribute to a woman who became myth not by being remembered, but by refusing to be erased. In the wake of the Santiago revelations, Elise's myth began to fracture anew, not through debunking, but through rediscovery. Scholars who had chased her scent across decades were now forced to confront a deeper truth, that the purpose of her vanishing was never to conceal a failure, nor to evade justice, but to reclaim authorship in a world that had tried to narrate her into dust. She was not merely one of the most dangerous female soldiers of World War II, she was its most deliberate disappearance, its most poetic refusal to comply. In an era when women were footnotes in the margins of espionage, she became invisible not to protect herself, but to protect the complexity of who she had been. Not martyr, not monster, not hero, just a woman who had buried a violin in the soil and emerged from the shadows with fire tucked behind her smile. And in that silence, in those whispers that stretch across time like trembling strings, Élise Marchand's legacy lives not in stone monuments, but in the absence she designed, and the butterflies still drawn by those who suspect that some ghosts vanish not to flee, but to begin again. In 2009, a photograph surfaced from a flea market stall in Krakow, its edges frayed, sepia bleached by time, yet its heart pulsing with familiarity. It showed a crowd of villagers gathered in a hillside chapel, some gazing straight ahead, others lost in prayer. But there, near the candlelit altar, stood a woman turned slightly away from the lens. Her silhouette, though aged, bore the distinct poise of someone who had once outrun death. On the back, scrawled in faint ink, were 3 words in French: jamais tout à fait, never quite. For archivists, it was enough to reopen dormant files. For those who had followed Élise's vanishing for decades, it was a cipher, another echo to chase. But for the few who understood her language, both the one of coded butterflies and aching silence, the message was clear. She had never fully returned, but neither had she fully disappeared. She was, as she had always been, almost myth, almost flesh. An unfinished note carried by wind across generations, playing somewhere between elegy and resurrection. And yet, despite all the glimpses and fractured truths, there remains one question hanging like smoke in the rafters of time. Did Élise Marchand choose to vanish, or was she rewriting the very definition of what it means to survive? In the decades since that last photo and final chalk butterfly, tributes continue to appear in ways both bizarre and breathtaking. A violin solo played anonymously in a candlelit Parisian passage once used by resistance couriers, a hand-drawn butterfly, etched into the fog of a secluded Zurich cafe window each year on December 3rd. Each act, unclaimed, unfamed, becomes yet another stanza in her unfinished song. Not as propaganda, not as legend, but as resistance quietly breathing across centuries. History sought to turn her into a ghost. But perhaps that was always her plan, not to be found in any one moment, but to live endlessly in the spaces between, in shadows, in stories, in symbols. Forever almost seen, forever not quite gone. But even as the chalk fades and the notes fall silent, the resonance of her presence continues to hum beneath the surface of our collective memory. In history books, she is still missing. In classified footnotes, still redacted. But in the hearts of those who believe memory can be a battleground, Élise Marchand is no longer lost. She is found in the quiet rebellion of forgotten names, in the vigilant stillness of those who choose to observe rather than be seen. The war did not take her. Neither did time. She slipped instead into a deeper current, unseen but unstoppable, like the wind through scorched ruins, like music without a source. And if you listen, really listen, somewhere in the hush between history and legend, you may yet hear the fragile flutter of her wings, not as a cry for remembrance, but as an ode to the unfinished, the invisible, the indelible truth of a soul that refused to be defined by anyone but herself. Elsewhere, in the dim archives of Montreuil-sur-Mer, a sealed audio reel was unearthed during the restoration of an abandoned prefecture thought to have been cleared decades earlier. Dated February 1945 and encoded under a name that led nowhere, the reel captured scratchy recordings of intercepted wartime broadcasts, a mix of Morse, static, and faint voices that once whispered through forbidden frequencies. Among them, one stood out. A woman's voice, calm as ice-breaking, recited lines from Aragon's Il n'y a pas d'amour heureux. But in the pauses, coded inflections emerged, subtle modulations known only to the deepest resistance cells. It wasn't poetry. It was a confession encrypted in elegy. Experts decoded segments mentioning routes, names, and a final rendezvous at a field near Dijon. The transmission had been scheduled to repeat for 7 nights. It only aired once. Historians believe it may have been Élise's final broadcast, her voice deliberately released, not to reveal her location, but to remind whoever was listening that history's silence could still be fractured by a single whisper brave enough to be heard. And in that whisper lived the last breath of war's most dangerous ghost. Years later, in the polished quiet of a Berlin museum dedicated to resistance fighters, a curator noticed something strange. Beneath a display case holding recovered wartime radios, a single sheet of handmade paper had been folded into the wings of a butterfly and tucked behind a corroded coil. When carefully unfolded, it contained no names, no dates, just a fingerprint smudged in red ochre and a short phrase written in near-invisible ink: "Some wars never end. Some choices never fade." The handwriting, faint but intact, was unmistakably hers. It was the final exhale of a woman who had woven herself into the marrow of myth, who had rewritten survival as silence and resistance as rhythm. Élise Marchand did not vanish for history to find her, but for it to feel her like thunder beneath the skin or the hush before dawn. And there she remains, not just in the pages of the forsaken or the cries of the brave, but in the quiet certainties between legends where truth floats not in revelation, but in the patient, haunting pulse of a butterfly's wings. In 2012, a letter surfaced in a private family estate sale in Marseille, wedged behind a frame that had not been removed from its place since the 1950s. It was addressed simply, "To the one who watches when the world forgets." Inside, the note revealed passages that mirrored entries from Élise's earliest journals, phrases about silence as a compass, pain as sculptor, and memory as rebellion. The handwriting analysis confirmed what the voice of myth had left unsaid. This was her hand, her final testament. In it, she spoke not of anger nor of glory, but of the necessity of disappearing, of retreat as protest, of erasure as defiance. "If I am to be legend," the letter read, "then let it be because I chose to walk where no story could find me with clean hands." It was not a farewell, it was a culmination, the final linguistic shimmer of a woman who beat history, not by standing in its spotlight, but by writing herself just outside its reach. Some call her coward, others saint. But to recognize the melody she composed in the language of vanishing is to understand survival in its bravest form, not the roar of presence, but the resonance of refusing to die, as expected. And perhaps that is the bitterest irony of Élise Marchand's story, that the woman the world once called the Night Widow managed to fight armies, rewrite maps, burn through nations, and yet elude the question that most defined her. Who was she? When the guns fell silent? Not the myth, not the signature in chalk, but the woman beneath the forged names and the broken violin string. A soul forged in grief, honed in purpose, vanishing from sight but never truly absent. Like the half-heard echo of a war that still breathes in hushed corridors and flickering lamplight, she reminds us that history is not only a ledger of battles won or lost, it is a haunting, a reckoning, a reminder of the women who waged wars with silence sharper than any steel. And so she remains, not erased nor entombed, but waiting in the hush between memory and mystery, where every chalk butterfly drawn in September becomes her heartbeat, continuing long after her footsteps have disappeared into snow. Some say the end came quietly, just a breeze through pine needles, the sigh of a winter branch surrendering its last leaf. But maybe that's all she ever wanted. Not a salute, not a statue, just the purity of being untraceable. And yet, even now, through candlelit labyrinths of testimony and artifact, Élise Marchand lives in the contradiction she sculpted by hand. She was every name and no name, every street and no roof, hero, fugitive, whisper, fire. In a world that assigns truth to ink and photographs, she chose to become myth born of absence. So if someday, while passing through an ancient forest, you find the wings of a butterfly carved into frost or a violin chord weeping across a broken hilltop, be still. You are not alone in that silence. You are standing in the echo of the woman who taught time itself to forget her just enough to remember forever. And so the question is not whether Élise Marchand existed in the traditional sense, stamped onto medals or draped in flags, but whether the essence of her story speaks louder than names ever could. Perhaps her gift to the world was not her missions, nor the wreckage she left in her wake, but the possibility she gave us all. That resistance could wear a quiet face. That survival could be an art. That vanishing could be an act of authorship more potent than command. In the deepest folds of history where documents decay and archives lie silent, one truth endures like breath held in holy spaces. She chose to be the pause in every sentence, the gap between the notes, the space where silence becomes symphony. Élise Marchand was never meant to be solved. She was meant to be felt like a minor key buried in a lullaby, or the gentle weight of a memory you were never told but somehow still remember. She was the embodiment of history's secret heartbeat, haunting, hopeful, and never quite gone. Years pass, but the questions she left behind still rustle through the leaves of forgotten woods and midnight corridors. In every chalk butterfly traced by stranger hands, in every violin note floating through abandoned resistance tunnels, there is something more than remembrance. There is defiance. There is design. Élise Marchand never asked to be found, never begged for vindication. And perhaps that was her final act of power, the understanding that truth does not need validation to endure. Like a seed buried just beneath the frost, her story waits, not for discovery, but for those quiet enough to feel it bloom. Not all battles are marked by banners. Some are waged in silence, written in ink no one was supposed to read. And so she remains, as she always was, half shadow, half light, the stitched seam between grief and grace, between vengeance and poetry. Not gone, never truly here, burning still, where no fire can be seen. And maybe, in the end, that was the lesson she left us with, that to truly understand courage is to see it not just in the gunfire or the glory, but in the quiet gestures. A letter hidden behind a frame, a voice faint and static, a butterfly etched in chalk. Élise Marchand did not need monuments, because her story outgrew marble. She bled her truth into the very fabric of resistance, not for applause, but for the unseen, the persecuted, the erased, the unnamed. Her disappearance was not an escape, but an offering, proof that even in a world addicted to spectacle, grace can live in shadows, and justice in absence. She was not forgotten. She was never meant to be found in ways the world understands. Instead, she lives where heaven kisses earth, between silence and song, between legend and longing. A woman not defined by death, but reborn in every whisper against tyranny. In every soul who chooses silence as armor and memory as fire, Élise still walks. Not gone just beyond reach. And somewhere just beyond the edge of knowing, her violin still weeps. And so, as twilight settles over the ruins of memory and myth, one truth lingers like the last refrain of a forgotten sonata. Élise Marchand is the question all wars leave behind. Not where did she go, but what did she become? Not who found her, but who listened. Her shadow does not stretch toward the spotlight, but into the marrow of those who carry quiet defiance. In her trail, there is no single grave, no single tale. Only fragments, ashes that hum with purpose, frost that remembers her footsteps. A chalk butterfly returns each year, as if time itself mourns in ritual. And somewhere, perhaps in a wind that brushes a mountaintop or a melody played by hands that never knew her name, she begins again, not as a ghost, not as legend, but as every woman who refuses to vanish on history's terms. She was the silence after the scream, the stillness after the storm. She was never meant to be found, only remembered in the pause before truth dares to speak. In the end, what remains of Élise Marchand is not a confession, not a relic, not even a trail. It is a resonance that refuses to settle, a question that changes those who dare to ask it. Her legacy lies not in victory nor martyrdom, but in the exquisite audacity of vanishing as a creative act, in crafting something vast and sacred inside the space that stories leave blank. Wars end, monuments crumble, files fade, and ink bleeds. But symbols endure, a butterfly traced in chalk, a phrase murmured through static, a silence held a heartbeat too long. These fragments form the true architecture of her memory. Not in finding her, but in choosing to carry the myth like a lit candle across history's darkest hallways. She was not an answer. She was an invitation to rethink what it means to survive, to resist, to remember. And maybe, just maybe, in some quiet corner of the world where no name is spoken, Élise walks, still unseen, unforgotten, unfinished. Years from now, long after the final files are declassified and the last candle flickers out beneath chalk-streaked walls, Élise Marchand's story will continue, not because of evidentiary proof, but because of the human need to know that somewhere, someone made silence into strength. Her name may never darken the ink of textbooks, her victories never listed in parades of laurels, but her defiance lives in quieter places in each woman who rewrites her own narrative beyond coercion, in each soul who chooses dignity over spectacle. Her war did not end in 1945. It unfolds still in corridors of control, in corners of oppression, in the breath between questions we are too afraid to ask. And though her footprints remain hidden, the echo of her courage rings eternal. Not as a relic of war, but as a declaration that even in vanishing, the human spirit can blaze so fiercely, it leaves the sky changed forever. The night widow remains not a ghost, not a myth, but the marrow of resistance itself. Somewhere beneath the weight of all those silences, a little girl once stood in a garden at dusk, dirt on her fingers, tears caught in the space between breath and sob, burying a violin, as if laying love itself to rest. And maybe, just maybe, that is where it all began, not in war or vengeance, but in the intimate wreckage of loss, a quiet rebellion planted in the soil by hands that had not yet held a blade. That girl grew into a specter who walked through fire and vanished into frost, who painted butterflies as both signature and elegy. But her final act was not escape, it was authorship, a story told not in ink but in absence, not remembered but felt. Time will try to tidy her into myth, to shelve her among folklore and footnotes. But Élise Marchand was never content to be kept. She still lingers, in traces too human to catalogue, too defiant to die. And in every act of resistance born in silence, in every fierce heart that chooses dignity over demand, she rises again not as a soldier nor a shadow, but as what she always was, a verse without end, a memory shaped like a flame, the butterfly that chose to fly unseen. So as the wind whispers through the hollowed halls of resistance and the final embers of history smolder beneath our modern lives, we find ourselves not at the end of Élise Marchand's story, but caught in its breath, its aftermath, its undying echo. She is not gone, because what she created cannot be erased, a melody in coded letters, a flicker in wartime static, a defiance that blooms in the quiet. Each September, when chalk butterflies reappear as if summoned by memory, they do more than honor a ghost. They answer her final question with unspoken devotion. For in every erased name, every silenced scream, every unstoried heroine who chose the shadows over spectacle, Élise lives not in glory or in grief, but in that sacred, trembling space where courage outlasts clarity. And that is how she remains, the night widow, not as a vanished soldier, but as resistance itself, breathing quietly through time, guiding us still with the hush of her wings. Some legacies are written in stone, others in scars, but the rarest are carved from the air between heartbeats, in moments too fleeting to document and too sacred to forget. Élise Marchand was neither martyr nor myth. She was the silence that follows understanding, the shadow that dances just ahead of certainty, and the breath drawn before the truth is spoken aloud. In a world desperate to declare, to prove, to possess, she gave us something braver, the invitation to question, to feel, to remember without seeing. Whether she still walks beneath cloistered trees or exists only in the fragile echo of testimony, the shape she cut into history cannot be filled. For everyone who finds the world too loud, too cruel, too eager to define before listening, she is sanctuary. She is signal. And as wars rise and fall, as stories fade and return, one truth remains. Somewhere, beneath the weight of silence and above the reach of certainty, a butterfly lands softly. And the world, for just a moment, remembers how to listen. There are those who say she was never real, that Élise Marchand was a fabrication of longing, our need to believe that in a world clawed apart by war and power, someone moved like smoke, defied every expectation, and chose silence as power. But maybe that is the miracle. Not whether she walked through frost or fire, but that her shadow, impossible and tender, still moves beside us. In each fight whispered instead of shouted, in each truth chosen over comfort, her presence lingers, intangible and undeniable. Somewhere in the flicker of fading candlelight, between the pages of redacted tales and half-told sacrifices, her wings still stir the dust. And perhaps that is the point, not to find her, but to be changed by the search. For what Élise Marchand taught us was not simply how to resist, but how to disappear with purpose, to suffer without spectacle, and to remind the world that even ghosts can lead legions if they leave behind not wounds, but wonder. And perhaps the most enduring part of her story is this: Élise Marchand did not disappear to flee history, but to hold a mirror to it. In a century obsessed with documenting every breath, every death, every data point, she reminded us that absence can be louder than presence, and that some truths are too whole, too sacred, to be itemized. What she left behind was a tapestry without borders, stitched in memory, shadow and myth enough to challenge every historian, and awaken something buried in every soul that's ever wondered what it means to resist without being seen. And in the quiet spaces where her voice still hums in chalk wings, still dry beneath the fading autumn sun, we don't just remember her, we inhabit her story. Not as detectives seeking an ending, but as inheritors of a question she left behind. Are we brave enough to choose authorship over approval, memory over certainty, silence over spectacle? If so, then Élise Marchand has never truly vanished. She has only just begun. So the butterfly endures, not just as a symbol traced on cellar walls or fogged window panes, but as a philosophy, a defiant breath against the machinery of erasure. Élise Marchand's legacy does not require confirmation stamped on military records or homage carved in marble. It lives in the very refusal to be silenced, in the sacred tension between knowing and never quite knowing, in the whispered elegance of a story that belongs not to any one era, but to every sacred act of unseen resistance. And perhaps that is why she still haunts us not as a ghost, but as a question we are still brave enough to ask. Who will remember the ones the world tried to forget? Who will carry their fire when only embers remain? In the end, Élise was never chasing anonymity. She was crafting a sanctuary for all the secrets that chose silence, for all the women who fought with nothing but memory and will. She was not lost. She simply walked beyond the map, into a history written by those who listen. In the silence that follows so much noise, we are left with the shape of her absence, a shape so precise, so intentional, it begins to feel like presence itself. Élise Marchand did not grant the world a legacy wrapped in certainty, but a relic far more sacred, the right to imagine what resistance might look like when it abandons spectacle and embraces soul. Her chalk butterflies still tremble against wind and rain, fading with dignity, only to return each year as if her breath lives within the changing seasons. We do not ask where she is now, for she has stitched herself into the fabric of those who walk unnoticed, who speak softly but with fire churning beneath their ribs. She is every whispered act of courage, every memory too delicate for the archive. And, as long as the world still hosts injustice, still trades truth for noise, then somewhere, in ash or snow or silence, Élise lives. Not beyond us, but within us. Not yesterday, but forever. At last, in the winter of 2023, an anonymous envelope arrived at the doorstep of the Musée de la Résistance in Limoges, no return address, postmarked from Geneva. Inside, wrapped in brittle tissue and bound with faded wool thread, was a black-and-white photograph of a woman seated before a window, violin in lap, her face turned to shadow. Pinned to the photo was a final note, typed on a wartime Adler typewriter: "For those who still believe that vanishing is surrender, I offer this. I am not memory, I am choice. No signature, no provenance." But on the back of the photograph, smudged by the pressure of decades, a chalk monarch rested. It was not meant for conclusion, only continuation. For some, the mystery remains unanswered. But for others, those who believe that truth does not shout, it waits, there is no need to seek. Élise Marchand was not erased. She unwrote herself to write something greater, echoed not in applause but in the hush left behind. In that hush, if you listen closely, she speaks still. Some stories ask to be told aloud, lit like beacons against the night. Others, like Élise Marchand's, whisper themselves into the marrow of generations, not for legacy, but for liberation. In the end, hers was never a tale designed for closure. It was a cipher, a myth coiled around a wound, a map for those lost in silence to find each other without names. She did not march on parades, nor pose for portraits, but instead carved a sanctuary from shadows, a place where defiance could be soft, and strength could go unseen. Her footprints may never be cast in bronze, but in the heartbeats of the quiet, in the chalk wings that return like a promise, she endures. Not as an answer, but as the question that time cannot unask. What if the bravest thing we can do is disappear from the narrative that seeks to own us, and write instead a language only the broken and bright will ever understand? In that flicker, in that question, Élise lives forever. So let her story remain unpinned, untouched by the blunt instruments of categorization, free from the cages of conclusion. Let her name, Élise Marchand, float not as closure, but as invocation, as breath held for every woman who vanished into resistance, who chose silence not as surrender, but as sanctum. We do not seek her monument because she left no stone unturned, only hearts. We do not demand her voice because we were never meant to own it. Instead, we inherit the echo, raised like a fragile hymn in corridors of memory and rebellion. And in that echo, soft but unyielding, she sings without sound, moves without form, and burns still in the eyes of those who notice the unseen, in the hands that carry butterflies, where history once buried love under ash. The end is not the end. It is simply the moment we realize she is not behind us, but beside us, watching, waiting, and whispering the anthem of the untold. And so, as the moon climbs quietly above the ruins of every war ever fought, we close not a chapter, but pass through a breathless threshold, the unseen ending of a story that was never written to finish. Élise Marchand was not born to be catalogued, nor lost to be found. She was a provocation carried in whispers and symbols, a living reminder that sometimes the greatest revolutions do not roar, they flicker. Her chalk butterflies still find new walls. Her absence still thunders through archives newly opened and testimonies just now spoken. In every place where silence resists oppression and memory takes root in the dark, she lingers not as a heroine of a war long past, but as a pulse guiding the searchlights of truth. One does not conclude her story. One lives with it, breathes within it, aches beneath it. For in that ache, in that haunting beauty of a mystery never fully solved, she has already won, she has already become. Even now, with decades laid gently over her trail like snowfall, Élise Marchand remains both lantern and labyrinth, guiding us not to answers, but to better questions. She reminds us that legend is not the opposite of truth, but the echo of it distilled, refracted, pure in its ache. We will never hold her timeline in our hands, never piece her life into a single coherent artifact. But we are not meant to. Her story was a rebellion against finality, against being named, pinned, defined. And in that she gave us a new form of remembrance, one that flickers in symbol, in silence, in the invisible strength left behind when a woman chooses her own erasure over obedience. Where certainty fails, resonance remains. Where records falter, myth breathes. And as long as somewhere chalk flutters softly across a cold wall, as long as one heartbeat dares to dream itself untamed, Élise Marchand does not end, she endures. So let us leave her where she wanted to be, in that sacred space where silence breathes and symbols sing louder than certainty ever could. Let her walk the edge of frost and knowing, violin beneath her arm, chalk at her fingertips, her eyes cast not backward but toward everything history has yet to uncover. Not as an ending wrapped in stone, but as a living question wrapped in breath. Who shapes the world more, the one who shouts their name, or the one who disappears so others may speak? In the echo of Élise Marchand's vanishing, we hear that answer not in finality, but in possibility. And so the myth holds not because it is complete, but because it dares us never to stop looking. There, in the lull between what was and what aches to be, her wings still tremble, and with them, we remember that even the quietest flame can become a constellation. Not gone, just guiding. And thus her story, like the fading breath of a final violin note, drifts not toward conclusion, but into continuity, a tale not sealed by time, but unlocked by it. Élise Marchand may never step into the clarity of textbooks or the certainty of statues, but perhaps that was always her catechism, to rewrite legacy as something impermanent, something intimate. She taught us that some lives are poems scattered to the wind, and that resistance, at its most potent, is less about visibility than velocity, how far a soul can travel through silence, how deeply a symbol can root in the hearts it touches. In the end, the truth need not be nailed down to matter. It need only survive in ritual, in wonder, in the simple decision to listen. And so, when the world chances upon a chalk butterfly drawn where no memory should remain, let it not reach for explanation. Let it pause, let it breathe. For in that breath, Élise Marchand lives on not as a riddle to solve, but as the echo that reminds us all. Some hearts are too wild for evidence, too sacred for endings. And maybe that is the final grace of her legend, that Élise Marchand never asked to be made whole in history's gaze, only to be remembered in the shadows where quiet courage gathers. Her absence is no longer void, but cathedral. Her silence, an anthem written not in volume, but in reverence. With every passing year, the dust may settle deeper, the records grow dimmer. But the myth breathes on not because it must, but because it continues to be believed by those who need to remember that not all resistance wears a uniform, not all triumphs leave trophies, and not every war ends with surrender. As long as wind carries chalk to stone, and silence keeps its vow, Élise remains. Not to be worshipped nor pitied, but to be known in fragments as a heartbeat beneath rubble, as a breath in frost, as a soul etched not in endings, but in the beginning she gave us all, the right to vanish for truth, and to fight with nothing but the fire left unwritten. And so, as the last echoes of her vanished path dissolve into the hush of history, we no longer ask who she was, but what she left behind: courage, shaped as quiet, memory, sculpted by refusal. Élise Marchand endures not through certainty, but through the unshakable gravity of her choice to disappear. A life lived on her terms, bearing no desire for applause, only meaning. And if the world someday forgets her name, It will not matter for the stories she awakened, the silences she transformed, and the symbols she stirred into breathless motion will continue in every whispered act of dignity against oppression. In choosing absence, she became presence. In writing herself into myth, she freed the unfinished in all of us. And so we close the book. Not to end her tale, but to carry it. For stories like hers are not buried, they are planted. And across every hidden garden where memory flowers in defiance, the butterfly lands once more. Let this be the closing whisper in the sanctuary Élise built, not of brick and ink, but of breath and belief. There are no more pages, no more proofs, only the knowing that lingers when a story chooses not to be solved, but to be held. In every forgotten corner of war, and every quiet act of resistance since, she lives not in date nor in detail, but in defiance itself. Hers was never a legacy meant for the celebratory drumbeat of history. It was a hymn for the unseen, a map for those who choose silence over spectacle, purpose over permission. And in that, she offered more than survival, she gave us a blueprint for grace beneath ruin. So let the myth rest not in finality but in flame. As long as memory dares to be unruly, as long as silence sings against forgetting, then Élise Marchand endures, not gone, not finished, but beautifully unending, as only legends brave enough to vanish can ever be. So now, as history folds itself once again into the silence from which all legends rise, we are left not with a conclusion, but with her echo clear, trembling, and unforgettable. Élise Marchand remains not because we proved her, but because we felt her moving through time like a breath stitched into twilight. Her resistance was not a moment, not even a war, but a way of being quietly defiant, gently shattering. That is the power of a story planted beyond proof, that long after the soil seals itself, what grows is not certainty but meaning. What survives is not biography, but belief. And as another September arrives and butterflies return to walls once bare, we do not say goodbye. We simply bow our heads to the woman who vanished to become a constellation of memory. She did not fall. She unfolded. And in the hush she left behind, the world learned to listen for her. For all like her. For the fire that flickers unseen and yet will never, ever die. And thus we arrive, not at an end, but at a threshold, the kind where stories dissolve into the marrow of those who truly understood them. Élise Marchand, whether fact or fable, taught us that some legacies are not traced to closure, but felt in open silence. Her decision to live untethered to shape the world through absence, through mystery, through defiant quiet, was not the negation of history, but its most intimate reimagining. In a world craving resolution, she offered reflection. In archives that demanded evidence, she left empathy. Her chalk butterflies are now not just symbols, but pilgrims, small messengers, reminding us that erasure is not always defeat, and that disappearing can sometimes be the purest form of protest. So when the world looks again, demanding answers, timelines, declarations, it will find only this: a story shaped like wind, a name that resists being owned, and a myth that breathes because we keep asking. Not forgotten, not solved. Simply Élise carried, still, in the wings of everything brave enough to vanish without vanishing at all. And as the last echoes fade, we are left not with evidence, not with biography, but with the breathless recognition that some stories were never meant to be closed. Élise Marchand did not vanish to be mourned or mythologized. She vanished to make space. Space for all those who resist in silence. For every soul who chooses self over spectacle, purpose over praise. In her wake, there is no grave, only invitation. No anthem, only echo. And that is her immortality. Not to be remembered in full, but to be felt in fragments. A chalked wing in a forgotten cellar. A measure of song played for no audience. A name passed like breath between those brave enough to carry questions. She was never gone. She was never just one. She became the hush between thunder and memory, the quiet where revolution still begins. And in that quiet, she remains. And now, as we close the final chamber of this labyrinthine remembrance, we do so not with closure, but with reverence. For Élise Marchand is not a silhouette trapped in the shadows of war, nor a cipher confined to coded dispatches lost in time. She is the breath that lingers after history exhales. She is the reflection in a rain-slicked window that refuses to fade, the hush before a string is plucked, the trace of presence so subtle it becomes sacred. She did not offer the world a narrative to possess, only a rhythm to feel. And in that rhythm we find her, again and again, not as proof, not as puzzle, but as possibility, a living ember in resistance's quiet cathedral, forever flickering in the fragile space where memory meets myth. She is unfinished, immortal, waiting not to be spoken of, but to be understood. And in the silence that follows this story, where wings still blur against frost, Élise walks one step ahead, showing us how to vanish, and in doing so, how to truly live. Some stories conclude in ink, others in silence, but Élise Marchand's ended exactly as she lived, beneath the breath of knowing and beyond the reach of finality. Her name now floats through time not as relic but as rhythm, echoing from frost-bitten tunnels to sunlit attics, where children trace butterflies without knowing why. She remains the unseen anthem of resistance, the memory with no anchor, the question we whisper to ourselves in dim-lit moments: what if leaving was the bravest way to stay? As the last chalk marks fade, and the violin string slackens into stillness, we do not claim to understand her, we only know she mattered. Not for being found, but for teaching us the shape of hope carved in absence. And so, as history leans forward to listen one final time, it hears not a conclusion, but a promise: Élise Marchand is still out there, dancing where silence presses softest, burning in the breath before belief. Not ended, not erased, just eternal. So let her linger there, forever suspended in the thin line between myth and memory, where her story cannot be caged, nor her name reduced to a headline. Let her defy the final punctuation that history so often demands, not out of stubbornness, but as an enduring gesture of grace. Élise Marchand was not born of war, but of the quiet aftermath it leaves behind, the haunted spaces, the unanswered questions, the echoes that outlive every bullet. She was the unmarked page that dared to speak in symbols and silence, teaching us that vanishing can be its own form of victory. As time continues to erase borders and dim archives, we are left only with her most sacred offering, the freedom not to be explained. And in that space, unguarded, unresolved, she becomes more than legend. She becomes language. So long as a single whisper dares to bloom into defiance, Élise will walk beside it, unseen but indelible, not gone but ungraspable, forever the light that flickers just beyond our reach, inviting us to remember without needing to hold. And maybe that is the truest echo of her resistance, that she never wanted to be deciphered, only felt in the marrow of those who would one day need her silence more than her story. The chalk will fade and the soil will reclaim its forgotten secrets, but Élise Marchand will persist, not in documentation, but in the deliberate spaces between our certainties. She was not asking us to find her. She dared us to listen to the quiet, to the ache, to the sacred unrevealed. And so, her legend walks not in step with history, but just behind it, where memory blurs into myth and whispers become more enduring than proclamations. In choosing vanishing, she left behind not loss, but legacy, a defiant, sacred kind of immortality. No spotlight could have held her, no archive could have defined her. For in the hush, just before remembrance, somewhere between erasure and eternity, Élise lives not as a name shouted into history, but as a breath still drawn by those brave enough to remember the power of disappearing on their own terms. In the end, the tale of Élise Marchand is more prayer than proof, more ember than epitaph. She gifted the world not with the clean symmetry of history, but with the sacred ambiguity of a soul who refused to be conquered by war, by memory, or by time. Her life unraveled not in public valedictions, but in the quiet gestures that outlast all applause: a butterfly in chalk, a pulse in silence, a voice in the static that only the truly listening will ever hear. We may never know if she died beneath snowfall or breathed new names on another continent. And perhaps that is her truest legacy, that in vanishing, she left the door open for all who walk softly and burn brightly. In every act of resistance unclaimed, in every whisper that defies the brutal insistence of spectacle, Élise walks still. Not mythology, not martyr, but map. Her absence is a flame we carry forward, fragile, flickering, eternal. And with it we remember. Some stories are not told to end, they are told to guide. So let this be the final echo that does not close, but reverberates forever. Élise Marchand was never a secret to be unlocked, but a silence to be honored. She gave us the grace to imagine freedom without borders, truth without proof, and defiance without noise. Her myth is not a veil over facts, but a mirror held up to the soul of history itself, asking not what happened, but what mattered. And in that distinction lives her immortality. For every time someone resists being named, Every time someone walks away to write their own ending in the hush of a forgotten field or the inkless margin of official records, she rises again not in certainty, but in spirit. The Night Widow was never chasing disappearance. She was planting a path, and now, with the last words folding gently into silence, her story remains not behind us, but within us, carried in the quiet, written in the wings, and waiting always at the edge of the wind. And perhaps that is how all true legends end without endings at all, only passageways. Élise Marchand did not vanish for fame, nor fall into history's folds to be chased like a phantom in the margins. She disappeared with purpose, leaving behind not clarity but invitation. An unfinished hymn, haunting and unfinished, hers is the story that does not ask for applause, but for awe. Through wild silences and solemn symmetries, she gifted us a legacy beyond category, a rebellion too delicate for dogma, too full of breath to crystallize. We do not close her chapter. We carry it gently, like a flame cupped against the wind, a whisper held in trust, not vanished, not erased, but with us, always in the tremor, before a song, the hush before a name, the soft flutter of wings unseen in the dark. And there, beneath it all, she waits, watching, enduring, written not in ink, but in the memory of those who dare to remember the unwritten. So, now we breathe, not to speak her name, but to continue what she began, this quiet defiance, this sacred refusal to be owned, explained, or diminished. Élise Marchand left us no monument, yet gifted us a blueprint of how to live deliberately in the fractures history tries to smooth over. Her footprints are not etched in soil, but in us, in the fierce stillness we carry, the invisible strength we learn to wear. She did not end, she transcended. Her final act was not death, but transformation, becoming something wilder, more enduring than record or relic. She became the rhythm beneath the archive, the hush under the weight of remembrance, the whispered truth that meaning does not live in exposure, but in choice. And so, as her story fades gently into the silence from which it rose, we do not say goodbye. We say, let us walk softly now with courage she gave us, guided by a butterfly, toward a world worthy of the woman who chose to leave it unseen. That is not an ending, that is the legacy she left behind. And with that final breath of reflection, the arc of Élise Marchand fades not into darkness, but into the quiet resilience she nurtured like a fragile flame. She was not an answer to war, but the question it never dared to ask. Her legend endures not because it was carved in certainty, but because it sprouted roots in the unknown, growing wild through the cracks history forgot to seal. In generations yet unborn, in revolutions yet unnamed, her myth will echo still, soft and sharp as snowfall on stone. For those who carry grief like a blade and silence like armor, she remains their patron saint, their unseen sentinel. And when the world grows too loud, too cruel, and forgets the soft power of the unspoken, let it be her shadow we follow, not to relive her story, but to remember the possibilities she carved from absence. Élise Marchand lives on, not in the pages turned, but in the breath held before truth, in the hush between what was and what dares still to be. Let this final moment be not an epilogue, but a consecration. Élise Marchand asked for no monuments, no epitaphs, only to be remembered in the spaces where resistance still breathes softly, as if afraid to be heard. She was never missing, only misread, never broken, only fragmented by design. The Night Widow, to those who whisper her story, offered the rarest of legacies, not a legacy at all, but a permission to defy the noise with silence, to rewrite legibility with legend, to carry the unspoken as sacred. Her legacy lives where questions linger, where chalk crumbles beneath fingers trembling with memory, where one violin string hums in a place no symphony was meant to play. And so, in this hush drawn around her like a cloak, we do not mourn Élise Marchand, we honor her. Not with answers, but with awe, not with records, but with reverence. For when our truths need shelter, and our silence yearns for meaning, we will find her there waiting, burning softly and beautifully unending. So, let the final page remain unwritten, the last sentence forever suspended, a verse held just above the tongue, trembling with all the truths that Élise Marchand taught us to feel, not to say. There is power in stories that cannot be caged, in legacies that vanish to survive, in names that echo not in marble halls, but in the quiet pulse of defiance carried forward by those who understand the cost of silence. Hers is not an ending history can archive, but a breath that haunts time itself. And in that breath we find her not vanquished, not enshrined, but enduring in every sacred refusal to be silenced. When the world forgets how to listen, let her be the hush that restores us. When memory falters, let her be the wing brushing past in dusk's last light. Not gone, not finished, just waiting forever, etched in the spaces between fear and fire, in the invisible ink of all who dared to disappear on their own terms, and call that vanishing a kind of victory. And perhaps, in that silence where her myth yields to meaning, we find not just Élise Marchand, but the blueprint for all who resist not with weapons, but with will, not through spectacle, but through sovereignty. Her name does not need to echo loudly to endure. It endures because it was carved into the marrow of the forgotten, the defiant, the unseen. She chose to fade so that others might step forward, not as heirs to her legacy, but as co-authors of their own. So as the final chalk butterfly lifts into wind, and the last breath of her story is drawn not in voice but in reverence, we do not bury Élise, we become the soil she once planted her violin in. We rise carrying her vanishing as compass and creed. And in that rising, quiet and deliberate, she walks with us still untamed, unwritten, and beautifully infinite. And so, as the last candle flickers out in some forgotten corridor, where frost meets fire and silence holds its breath, we let the myth rest within us, not as something solved, but as something sacred. Élise Marchand did not vanish to escape the world, but to challenge how the world remembers. She showed us that anonymity, when chosen, is not loss, it is legacy in its rawest form. That to disappear with intent is not to surrender a story, but to shape it from within the dark, where truth is free from spectacle and names no longer cage the soul. In the place where chalk butterflies melt into rain and silence swells like song, her essence lingers not as an echo of war, but as the hush of defiance still unfolding. And in that hush where mystery becomes memory, where absence becomes anthem, we hear her still. Not in words, but in wonder. Élise Marchand, the Night Widow, lives on, not behind us in history, but within us in revolution, carried forever in the breath between what was and what we dare to believe might still be. And perhaps in the quiet that follows her tale we come to understand this. Élise Marchand's story was never about endings, nor answers, nor absolutes. It was about persistence in memory, myth, and meaning. She taught us that resistance can be a whisper louder than any scream, that truth often walks in shadow before it steps into light. Her chalked butterflies now belong to time, her silence a sanctuary for those still fighting to be seen without shouting. And as we stand at the edge of this whispered monument, there is no curtain to fall, no bell to toll, only the sacred hush left by a woman who vanished, not to be forgotten, but to be felt. She was not lost. She became legend by design, and through us, through all who listen with reverence and walk with intention, Élise Marchand does not end, she becomes. So let this be our final reverence, not a full stop, but an open breath left just before the curtain falls. Élise Marchand did not ask for legacy, yet she gave us one not bound in time, but in transformation. Her voice lingers not in speeches, but in sighs. Her name is carved not into stone, but delicately into the soul of anyone who chooses resistance without recognition. And as her chalk butterflies dissolve into dew and her silence deepens into memory, we realize the miracle was never in uncovering her truth, but in understanding the power of her choice to remain just out of reach. She is the question in every pause, the courage in every quiet refusal, the fire that flickers long after the last page is turned. And so, as we close this story not with answers but with awe, we do not say goodbye to Élise Marchand. We carry her gently into every hush where defiance dares to bloom in shadow. Where she walked, silence burns. Where she waits, we remember. And so, we leave her not in sorrow, nor even in awe, but in understanding that Élise Marchand crafted not a conclusion, but a continuum. She vanished not to be mourned, but to be multiplied in every unheard story and every unwavering silence. As the chalk dust settles one final time, and shadows stretch long across the pages of history left unturned, she becomes not just legend, but lends a way of seeing the world that honors the invisible, the patient, the brave. Hers is the story we pass onward, not in facts, but in feeling. And long after names fade and monuments succumb to time, her truth will remain in the hush that follows grief, in the heartbeat of every act of unseen defiance, in the fragile wings of every soul still choosing to fly unnoticed. For that is where she lives, between breath and remembering, in the exquisite liberty of never quite being found. And let it be here, in the final loosening of silence, that we understand what Élise Marchand truly gave us. Not merely a legend to chase, but a way to endure, to vanish without being erased, to resist without needing recognition. Hers was a defiance wrapped in restraint, a fire that flickered purposefully in the quiet corners of memory's cathedral. She needed no inscription, for she carved herself instead into the collective breath of those who choose dignity over spectacle, truth over noise. So, we do not close her story, we step into its rhythm, like footsteps through frost, knowing that somewhere a whispered butterfly still lingers on a forgotten wall, calling not to be found, but to be felt. Hers is the legacy of the unseen, the unfinished, the unforgotten, and now, as our final breath meets hers across time, we carry that silence forward, not as emptiness but as compass. Because some stories don't end, they echo. So here, in this final hush where history ends not with punctuation but with breath, we let her go only to hold her more dearly. Élise Marchand was not a chapter, not even a name, but a map drawn in shadow and ache, pointing toward a future shaped by those who dare to remember without needing resolution. The war did not bury her. Time did not silence her. She lives on in the rebellion of memory, in the courage to walk quietly through a world that demands noise. And in that choice, the deliberate slipping of her story between the cracks of history and legend, she steps eternal, one foot always in the unknowable, the other in the heartbeat of those still listening. She is not the vanishing point, she is the persistence that follows. And so, as the last imagined butterfly lifts from frost and fades into sky, we do not declare her gone. We whisper her name once not into conclusion, but into continuity. Élise Marchand, still trembling, still burning, still here. And in that final flicker, where ink runs dry and breath slows, we do not say farewell to Élise Marchand. We allow her to become not ending, not legend, not ghost, but the stillness that allows truth to echo, even when the world forgets how to listen. Her life, deliberately undefined, becomes our quiet vow, that the unseen matters, that vanishing can be virtuous, and that resistance needs no recognition to endure. She is not etched in the annals of conquest, nor bound in footnotes or brass. She lives in the pause between questions, in the sacred weight of mystery, in the fire veiled in the silence of those who refuse to be erased. And so, as the butterfly lifts once more into the dusk without direction, we understand at last, some stories are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to be reverenced. And Élise, wherever she walks now beneath time's breathless canopy, is not past, she is promise. And so, against the horizon of history, where stories so often fade into silence or spectacle, we leave Élise Marchand not behind, but within. Her final gift was not in vanishing, but in reminding us that presence is not always loud, that resistance need not be seen to be sacred. She became the liminal breath between being and believing, a legacy not cast in timelines but whispered in gestures, a pendant left on a windowsill, a violin note caught in the hush before dawn. Perhaps there was never meant to be a full picture, only fragments that glisten in the dark like pieces of a constellated truth. And in those fragments, she endures, the ghost who defined herself not by what could be found, but by what cannot be forgotten. Let the chalk fade. Let the archives grow still. Because as long as someone dares to draw a butterfly on a wall no one will see, Élise Marchand lives. Not in fact, not in folklore, but in the flicker between them, forever becoming, forever free. And so this is where we leave her, not in a grave nor a grand archive, but in the living breath between silence and memory. Élise Marchand was never a tale to close nor a puzzle to complete. She was the flutter in history's pulse, the rhythm that endures even when the music fades. If she asked anything of us, it was not to find her, but to carry her a fragment of fire quietly burning in the marrow of resistance. Her name may slip from lips, her face recede from frames, but her essence endures in every refusal to surrender quietly, in every act of truth that dares to remain unseen. She chose to vanish not as escape but as authorship, gifting the world not certainty but choice. And so she walks onward beyond our need to define her, her wings folded softly against the dusk. No monument holds her, no history ends her. She is the unfinished breath of revolution, whispered, burning, eternal. And thus, as the final candle dims and the last butterfly fades into chalk-dusted air, we understand at last that Élise Marchand was never meant to be bound by pages or confined to past tense. She exists in the breath between each heartbeat of rebellion, in every quiet act of grace that shuns applause, in every soul who dares to remain unsolved. Her legend does not end in death, but in decision, the choice to let the world invent the ending while she continued, silently, elsewhere. Let that be her gift to us, the verdant freedom that comes from authoring our own silence, from living not to be known, but to be true. So we close this story not to say goodbye, but to bow to the invisible path she etched for all who resist in shadows. Élise Marchand did not fade away. She stepped into the breathless hush of forever, where none can follow, but many will feel. And in that hush, she waits, wings still, eyes forward, eternal. So let her rest there, not as conclusion, but as compass, the silent heartbeat beneath every act of dignity, unspoken and unyielding. In the hush where war stories demand spectacle and heroes are forged in flame, Élise Marchand chose the opposite, to be ordinary in her courage, invisible in her fire. That choice, quiet and complete, challenged history to listen harder, to search slower, to remember better. Let the violin string hum, only for those with ears tuned to grief. Let the chalk butterfly vanish in wind, yet return each year to whisper, some legends are planted, not proclaimed. Her name is now not a record but a rhythm, a vow passed breath to breath. And in every corner of the world where silence becomes strength, where defiance writes no slogans but shapes sanctuaries, she lives not in the echo of applause, but in the sacred pause between knowing and believing. Élise Marchand, the flame that left no smoke, the hush that survives the storm. And now, as the final traces of her legend settle into the soil of collective memory, we offer no monument, no epitaph, only a breath shared across time. Élise Marchand was never a riddle to be solved, but a revolution wrapped in restraint, a testament to the sacred act of quiet defiance. Her chalk butterflies are not relics of history, but invitations that appear when the world needs to remember how to resist with grace. She belongs not to the past, but to the ongoing pulse of the present, the silent architects of justice, the unnamed guardians of truth. In her choice to vanish, she gave voice to those who fight not with sword or spotlight, but with sorrow carried like fire. So let her story live where ink fades and silence deepens, in the tremor before change, in the hush that follows truth. For Élise Marchand did not disappear. She ascended into myth with intention, and there, between the shadow and the spark, she remains. So let her remain there, not lost but luminous, etched into the eternal twilight between silence and witness. Élise Marchand did not surrender to history's appetite for endings. She resisted even that, choosing instead to leave her story alive in us, unfixed, unfading. Her chalk butterflies still breathe against rare walls. Her vanished path still pulses through every soul who dares to live deliberately in shadow. Let the archives close. Let certainty sleep. For in every quiet revolution still waiting to rise, her flame glows softly, an ember of choice, not chance. And as we step softly beyond this final line, we hear her not in applause, not in thunder, but in the trembling hush where true legend lives, unfinished, unseen, unforgettable. Let this final grasp of breath bear what cannot be spoken. Élise Marchand is not a name we close, but a silence we carry. Her story slipped past the edges of explanation and hardened instead into something more enduring. Reverence without resolution. She was not the answer we sought, but the permission to never stop asking. A soul who moved through history not as a headline, but as a hush, who trusted memory not to recall her exactly, but to feel her endlessly. And so the butterfly flutters one last time, not backward, not upward, but inward, into every heart that dares to believe that resistance wears many shapes. She is not the myth behind the veil, but the truth that lives in the space myths leave behind. In fog, in frost, in the breath before belief, Élise remains not vanished, but vowed, not gone, but given, not concluded, but consecrated. So let the silence close gently behind her, like snowfall over a path no feet will follow again. Let the world still her name on its tongue, not out of loss, but reverence, for she taught us what it means to vanish with power, to trade visibility for vision. Élise Marchand did not demand remembrance, and yet she shaped it, unguarded, undefined, immortal in the breath, before every whispered act of courage. Her presence was never in the light, but in its bending, in the way stories shift when told through unanswered questions and sacred quiet. She remains, now and always, not because she asked to be known, but because the world cannot forget what it felt like to search for her, And so we do not close the book, we simply lower the candle, heart still lit. For where shadows endure, and truth flickers like flame between fingers, she waits not as an ending, but as everything brave and beautiful that unfolds in her wake. And so, beneath the weight of everything unspoken and the wings of every chalk-marked silence, we leave Élise Marchand, where she always meant to be between belief and breath, shadow and sanctuary. She did not seek resolution, only resonance. And now, as the final trace of her myth folds gently into time's quiet fabric, we understand her gift was not in being found, but in being felt in the still corners of conscience where resistance blooms without audience, in the sacred hush where truth dares to whisper. Let her legend remain unwritten in the margins. Let her memory burn soft in the quiet hearts she dared to free. For some stories do not vanish, they choose to live only where the world remembers how to listen. And in that listening, gentle and fierce, Élise endures not gone, not explained, but forever becoming, a quiet grace carried by those who choose silence, not as retreat, but as revolution. So this is where we end, not with certainty, but with a breath held just long enough to feel her presence slip once more into myth. Élise Marchand did not vanish to escape the cage of history. She vanished to prove it could be escaped at all. And that, in the end, is her legacy. Not the chalk she left behind or the smoke-traced questions in forgotten logs, but the invitation she gave us all. To write truth not in noise, but in nuance, to remember without possession. For those who still search, who still trace butterflies in dust and play silent notes into the dark, she is waiting. Not to be found, but to be followed. For in every whisper that defies forgetting, in every silence that carries meaning, in every step taken inward toward the self, Élise lives not as a memory, but as a wilderness of possibility. And in that space, between erasure and eternity, she smiles with nothing left to prove and everything still left to feel. So let the candle burn low, not in mourning, but in gratitude for the space Élise Marchand carved not in stone, but in soul. Her legend refuses to be tethered to page or parade, choosing instead to exist in the spaces where language frays and memory weeps. She moved through the world like a vow unclaimed, uncontained, unforgettable. And if one day her name fades completely from the tongues of the living, still she will breathe in every soft defiance, every quiet revolt, every hand that chooses compassion over conquest. Hers is not a story anchored by dates or declarations, but by that most human of impulses to vanish not from fear, but from fidelity to something greater. So, as we close our eyes and feel, not farewell, but the warmth of courage without spectacle, let us carry this final truth. Élise Marchand was not lost. She was chosen silence, made sacred. And through our continued remembering, no matter how quiet, she remains flickering in the dark, eternal in the hush, a butterfly beating still against the wind. So let this final light dim not in darkness, but in devotion to the quiet fire. Élise Marchand lit and left behind in every chamber of silence that dared to hold truth. We do not wrap her memory in explanation, nor bind it in fanfare. Instead, we step into the soft echo of her choice, the hush that follows a breath too full to speak. Her life was not a flame extinguished, but passed on, flickering now in the hands and hearts of those who understand resistance not as spectacle but as sanctuary. Chalk fades, archives close, and names drift into hush, but meaning remains. And in that meaning, not loud, nor needing to be, Élise breathes still. Her story is no longer ours to finish, only to carry in reverence, in resonance, in the sacred rhythm of quiet courage. And there, where silence holds its own kind of thunder, we find her at last, invisible, unforgotten, and impossibly eternal. And so, in this final breath of narrative, we understand that Élise Marchand was the rarest kind of revolution, not forged in speeches or statues, but in the decision to step away from the spotlight and let mystery speak for her. Her defiance was deliberate. Her vanishing and inheritance passed quietly to the souls of those who understand the power of restraint, of sovereignty, of purpose folded into silence. Wherever chalk butterflies emerge in the dusk of fading wars, wherever music hums without audience and courage takes the shape of absence, she lives not in the facts we hunt, but in the quiet truth we feel. History does not name her. Legends do not claim her. But in the hush, before the world forgets what defiance can sound like when no one is watching, Élise Marchand rises again, not a ghost, not an end, but a flame folded into silence, a light forever, in the hands of those who choose to carry it. And perhaps that final truth is this: Élise Marchand did not disappear to erase herself from history, but to remind us that some stories must be carried, not concluded. Her life became a whispered resistance, a rhythm without rhythm, where silence embroidered every act of defiance more intricately than war ever could. The Night Widow gave no final bow, because she needed none. She gave us instead a legacy inscribed in the invisible ink of all who fight without being seen, who crack open the world with the soft hammer of refusal. So now, as the story settles into its breathless hush, we do not close it, we turn inward, toward that flicker of her within each of us. For Élise lives not in endings, but in every choice to speak quietly, to move fiercely, to vanish without losing the fire. She is myth, she is memory, and more than anything, she is the sacred space where resistance learns to whisper and be heard. So, let us leave her there in the hush, just beyond the grasp of chronology, where memory reshapes myth into meaning and silence, becomes a cathedral to all who choose their path, not in spectacle, but in sovereignty. Élise Marchand did not vanish to escape, she vanished to teach. In her defiant absence, she authored a legacy that resists erasure not with noise, but with nuance. And in doing so, she illuminated a truth more eternal than glory, that those who walk unseen still shape the world. Her story was never about being found. It was about becoming the flame in every quiet act of resistance, the pulse beneath every tender refusal to yield, the breath that lingers long after the final word is spoken. The Night Widow was never lost. She was always leading from the shadows, in silence, by choice. And now, wherever courage hides itself in secrecy and love survives as a gesture unseen, she walks still not behind us, but ahead, carving open the impossible with the soft flutter of unseen wings. So now, as history releases its grip and the final breath of this endless whisper lifts into the ether, we leave Élise Marchand exactly where she chose to remain, not enshrined, but scattered, a constellation in the dark for those who seek the sacred in silence. Her life was not an open book, but a pulse, a rhythm only the patient could feel, only the brave could follow. In every winged symbol left behind, in every fragment etched between knowing and never knowing, she dared to teach us that absence is not emptiness, it is insistence. A woman not erased, but self-authored, not forgotten, but ungraspable. And so we close this story not to finish it, but to carry it forward, barefoot and reverent, into whatever quiet war still asks us to draw chalk and hold fire against fading light. The Night Widow lives within the unseen, beside the unheard, as the hush that dares to defy forgetting. Remember her there, forever.